Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar this morning covering migrating file storage to Azure. As the UK's leading Microsoft Cloud partner, we strive to bring the most pertinent information from the most trusted sources. Today we are joined by Incentra, a global Microsoft Gold partner, with Edmund Davis, a cloud solution architect for Incentra, taking you through the webinar. A quick bit of housekeeping. During the webinar, you are muted, but you can submit questions at any time via the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. And there will be a Q&A session at the end to answer all of the submitted questions. Also, the webinar recording will be made available afterwards, and if you can please complete the form at the end where you can request a call back from one of our Byte specialists. I will now hand you over to Edmund.
Thanks, Andy. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for attending. I'm just going to share some slides that we've got, which I hope you can now see.
Yep, all good.
Great. Well, we'll continue. Thank you very much for attending, everybody. We've already had one or two questions, but as Andy said, we very much welcome questions as we go along, and we'll pick them up at the end. I'm aiming to cover off a few topics to do with migrating file shares primarily. You will already have seen, I'm sure, previous webinars and lots of content about cloud migrations overall. Here we're going to do not a deep dive, because this isn't a technical webinar, but an overview of options and approaches to migrating file shares and data content into Azure and the Microsoft Cloud environment. As I said, do feel free to post questions as we go along. The overall agenda for today is to think about this challenge at a business level, at an architectural level, and look at the various approaches we can take. We want to understand the problem and the opportunity that's there, explore technical options and approaches, look at some of the decision points, and consider next steps and how we might enter into this into cloud file shares and cloud file collaboration. I've got a few headings that are very high level to walk through with us about the people and about the content that's in the file shares. We're in a time of rapidly evolving technology landscape that we're all very aware of at every level in business. The technology that we're working with has changed remarkably since file shares first came along, and we'll look at and see a little about how those changes are affecting the businesses and how we can leverage the new tools to our advantage. We're also going to talk about what's going to motivate the sorts of changes we might want to make, how to choose an approach, what the impact will be on the people we work with in our organizations, and both internally and external collaborators, and think a little bit about how we approach this change that's coming up so fast. So the first topic I think to focus on is about who uses these file shares. We know they've been around for a long time. The way that file shares have been presented in our businesses has pretty much remained stable for, getting on for 30 years now, since the early days. But ultimately, who are the consumers? And I want to consider that people really are the driving force. Applications and systems and the back-end data that we look after on our servers and infrastructure is pretty much agnostic about how data is presented. Yes, it needs some capacity. Yes, it needs some performance to meet its technical requirements. But really, it's the people and the organizations of the files and the data that we can bring the most benefit to. Having organized file shares and understanding the data and how it's used in our file shares is really what's going to add the value to the IT service we deliver to our organizations. We know that the people have individual file shares. maybe their home drives or drive letters, mapped drives, or redirected folders in their profiles, and they feel very kind of personally about the data that lives in their personal drives. We like to have them centralized because it enables us to back them up, to provide a bit more flexibility in the way we work. But as we move into a cloud-first kind of landscape, we need to think about how we can extend that flexibility to the people, and what our people in the organizations need and can benefit to work as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Of course, we've also got departmental kind of shared folders and file shares, which contain content that's collaborated on by wide groups of people, wide ranges of people, and needs to be controlled in terms of its access to different audiences. So we'll think a little bit about whether the current paradigm for file shares is really fit for purpose in the departmental sense. We've also got company-wide data in file shares, and increasingly we want to be able to collaborate with other organizations external to our businesses through those with that data. So we'll consider a little about how we can surface some of that data more widely. And then, of course, beyond the people, we've also got systems and applications that rely on centralized data. And often we have to work closely with the vendors to make sure that the data storage provision that's made for applications scales well to meet the needs of those applications, whether they're big binary databases or lots of a complex file structure that's mandated and managed in the background by these applications. But any which way, we've all still got a lot of file data sprawled across our organizations, and increasingly it becomes a challenge to maintain a sufficient storage capacity and meet the performance requirements as applications move into the cloud and the infrastructure gets spread more broadly. So thinking about what's in the file shares, we know already that these things have been around a long time. File shares existed since any organization had more than one computer. Novell NetWare back in the 80s and 90s, early Windows NT, and the advent of Active Directory with Windows 2000 brought all these things into the mainstream use over 20 years ago, often over 30. And not really much has changed very much about how we've used file shares in all that time. We know that in some organizations, file shares have a very disciplined use around them, that the governance around the data that lives in file shares is very is well managed, and that's a tribute to those who are in charge of it. But in other organizations, file shares become a real dumping ground for all sorts of things, however well intentioned the data governance kind of is. And we know we've got lots of different types of consumers. We talked about the people a little, but thinking more specifically, we've got people wanting to store large amounts of media data for marketing purposes, or important business critical Excel spreadsheets that they want to be able to collaborate across a whole team about. And the current kind of generation of file shares based on NTFS and Windows Server shares doesn't always handle the types of content we have in file shares as gracefully as we might like. The challenge today, as data becomes more and more dynamic and increasingly larger with more multimedia and more video content and all that kind of thing, is to scale out the file shares and to make sure that we've got access to enough capacity and performance to deliver the user experience that both the people and the applications need. We've also got some tigers hiding in the file shares. They are often files that have been sitting there a long time, that have dependencies on applications, or that aren't at all suitable to be where they are. They can come and trip you up during these migrations, and any kind of any project needs good planning in advance to weed out these tigers and find make sure that you're not tripped up. So this is really an opportunity to get to know your data and to understand who needs to consume what data, whether it's in a single enormous monolithic file structure with lots of inherited permissions and broken permissions, or already very granular. This is also an opportunity to understand the business requirement and the opportunity to restructure your data to some extent. Some of the challenges that this legacy of huge file shares has brought to us are around the physical or virtual capacity of your storage on site. Maintaining on-site storage is expensive, and maintaining it in a resilient fashion, both locally and geographically, is very expensive. The likes of Microsoft and other cloud vendors, of course, have invested massively in huge infrastructure. So it's certainly a compelling thought process to wonder how we can use that massive scalability to offload some of our own burden of responsibility to the cloud vendors. We've also often heard in other cloud migration seminars about the need to move the whole workload. So to make sure we've got access to high performance and high capacity storage natively in the cloud. Standard file systems don't typically do version control very well. There are lots of exceptions, of course, and some excellent document management and file management tools available in the wider market, but natively in the Windows operating system, we've in the last few generations introduced volume shadow services and the ability to take snapshots, but not very much in control of the users, and certainly not tracking those changes in real time. There's always a window between snapshots that means that some change could get lost, and I'm sure everybody's been caught out by that at some stage. As I said, the need to maintain hardware on site and handle the hardware refresh cycles, and also the life cycle of the storage hardware, whether they're disks or SSD arrays or any other kind of storage arrangement, has an element of uncertainty to it that makes all our lives a little can make them a little fraught. You know, that drive that's part of a critical array is going to go down on Christmas Eve, and that's just the way of the world. So increasingly being able to offload the burden of responsibility for infrastructure to cloud service providers, cloud solution and cloud platforms is desirable, because it allows us to focus more on bringing the technology benefit directly into the business, rather than wielding the spanners of maintaining hardware infrastructure. And finally, one of the other challenges around on-premises file sharing is making this data available to other people externally in a safe way. We've all, I'm sure, heard of the concepts around zero trust security and moving the boundaries of our networks to make them less well defined, but it's always difficult to surface data in file shares to external parties in a safe way when the data resides within your organization. So the questions that are raised by this is, how could it be better? And in particular, we can think about the storage capacity. As I said, Microsoft have an enormous amount of investment in infrastructure and provide capacity on a scale that none of us could really have imagined 10 years ago. Second, in terms of the people, making data more accessible, giving people the opportunity to work more flexibly. Of course, people can use VPNs and what have you in this day and age, but everybody now likes mobile devices, and increasing the desktop applications that people are using, desktop and mobile applications that people are using, enable people to work more flexibly from any location on almost any kind of connectivity. And so surfacing the data in such a way that the files that they need to use to collaborate with one another in such a way as to facilitate that is obviously a huge benefit to the business. Also, we're also used entirely to using Google to find everything. There are, of course, other search engines, I must caveat, but discoverability is important. There are search tools that can scan file shares, but they haven't really been picked up with the same level as ubiquitously as cloud and web-based services, but being able to search from anything in Windows or in Office Online is extremely powerful, and extending that search capability to other cloud services is one of Microsoft's big pushes at the moment. Another facility that I've touched on that's really critical for modern day working is this collaboration. And in modern Office apps, there's a fantastic facility to co-author and collaborate on documents, spreadsheets, PowerPoint, all that kind of stuff in real time. Making sure that our file storage infrastructure can support that is going to really add value to the customers. And then finally, security and data protection. Being able to put rules and governance around our data to make sure that we really understand how it's being shared is an increasingly modern problem. Just sending an email attachment and losing control of it at that point is no longer acceptable for many organizations, and increasingly the technology is available to support that in modern platforms like Office 365. So how could we, what are the technologies and tool sets available to us to move these scenarios forwards? I'm going to run through some of the file-based scenarios and also think a little bit more about the wider cloud platforms, and in particular focusing on Office 365 because we're talking about Microsoft here. But imagining you've got your on-premise file share. One of the options we've got available is to simply lift and shift the existing file servers into Azure. There's a variety of tools, both Microsoft provided tools and third parties, to allow us to pick up server images, move them into Azure wholesale, and run them with all of the resilience and performance benefits that Azure can bring. The advantage of this kind of approach is that we can continue to use our existing technology, our existing infrastructure. If we've got DFS, for example, or we've got storage spaces, all of those can be brought to bear in Azure. The downside though is, of course, you're still running a Windows Server instance or several to manage your storage infrastructure. And with that goes the compute cost alongside that, and of course the storage and other Azure services that you're going to consume. So while it's certainly possible to lift and shift your file servers into Azure wholesale, but there may be better ways of doing it, and so we'll move on now just to talk about some of those other. Now, Azure, as we said earlier, offers up a boggling capacity for storage, and storage of lots of different types of things. But Microsoft have recently done a lot of work to improve the Azure Files service. And Azure Files is, as the name implies, Azure's facility for hosting file shares both in a traditional SMB kind of approach and also via web access. Those files, at first glance, live only in the cloud, but you can have enormous capacity, up to 100 terabytes for the large file facilities. In more recent times, Microsoft have also introduced Azure File Sync, which can really be thought of as a window into Azure Files. It's very much like DFS. It allows you to have multiple synchronizations across lots of different geographies, and it also provides a facility called tiering, which allows you to bring only part of your data on site, local to your users, if that's a requirement. When users go to open the files, the files get downloaded and cached locally, and after a period of time, when they haven't been used, they get put back into Azure and replaced with stubs. And this allows you to give the impression of an almost unlimited file server capacity, even to your on-premises users. The final option I'm going to look at from a conventional file share point of view is a NetApp service called NetApp Files in Azure. And I think the key point about the NetApp service, I'm not going to dwell on it because, of course, there's a lot of complexity, but the key point is it's extremely high performance. We'll come on to talk about performance in just a second, but the NetApp service although carrying a high cost under lots of independent testing, can provide significantly higher IOPS for accessing file shares in Azure than Microsoft's own native technology. And that's why Microsoft are also strongly supporting the NetApp approach. If your requirement is for high capacity and high performance, it's well worth looking at. So these are all kind of conventional file share approaches. You're not adding any particular functionality, at least not to the user experience. You get greater performance and greater capacity, and also similar kind of snapshot data resilience options, and some geo redundancy if that's important to you, subject to a couple of kind of constraints. But really, in terms of accessing files, the value we can bring to bear is by possibly changing the paradigm a little bit for the end users, for all of those colleagues that we work with and collaborate with. Moving files selectively into SharePoint Online and SharePoint-based technologies, whether they are Microsoft Teams or group-based functionality or SharePoint sites themselves, or even OneDrive. They are all based on a very similar set of SharePoint-based technologies and all add very similar user benefits. So the sorts of things we're talking about here are the integration with Microsoft Office apps, so natively Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all of that stuff opens SharePoint-based files very smoothly. You also have desktop sync using the OneDrive client, which I've always found a bit annoying that for the service and the sync client to be called the same thing. Microsoft have a bit of a habit of confusing us with using very similar names for slightly different concepts. But over the last few years, particularly, the OneDrive sync client has improved immeasurably. And the old, if anybody remembers the old Groove-based sync client, which was awful, I can assure you that the modern sync client is much more robust and performative too. Let's have a quick look at comparing the different technology features of these approaches, and that'll help us then move on to thinking about how to decide between them. So in the file-based solutions, we've got the infrastructure requirement, and we've also got to bear in mind the network performance between the Azure infrastructure and on-site. And that applies really to all the Azure-based services. We're not adding functionality, but we are maintaining a consistent experience for the users. Azure Files moves away from the infrastructure requirement. You don't need to host virtual machines to run your file shares. Capacity is similarly very high. And then just in the last week, Microsoft have released or announced the preview of a very useful new bit of functionality. Until recently, Azure Files relied on key-based authentication. It wasn't very kind of user context specific. And then a short while ago, they released functionality to integrate with Azure Active Directory domain services. So that's running Active Directory in Azure without the server infrastructure that we normally attribute to local Active Directory. And that's great because for things like, for applications that are solely hosted in Azure, you could have that user context-based authentication against Azure Files. But now, just in the last week, we have a preview release of an Active Directory authentication or hybrid Active Directory, I should say, authentication for Azure Files. So if your requirement is not so performance intensive, you can provide file shares in the way that you're completely used to in Azure to your users authenticating with their Active Directory credentials. They do need to be synced to Azure AD, but by and large, you get a similar single sign-on experience that you would get if you're accessing on-premises file shares. The Azure File Sync functionality keeps you very close to what you've got at the moment with on-site, on-premises file shares. The key advantage being you get the resilience and robustness of Azure file storage and also the extra capacity. And it also means that you can offload some of the burden of maintaining high volume capacity local storage and use the Azure File Sync to cache and tier the data. Azure File Sync is also compatible with DFS namespaces, but by and large, Microsoft would say that it replaces DFS replication because the Azure File Sync services themselves provide that replication service with Azure as the master. In the SharePoint world, we talked earlier about the difference between different types of files, and file services, file shares in Azure or on premises are always going to be valuable for the sorts of data that it doesn't get used for collaboration or is relied upon by applications or logging or all of those useful things. SharePoint, on the other hand, is absolutely, or SharePoint-based solutions are absolutely tailor-made for collaborative working between people who need to share content and work together. So this is really where we have an opportunity to restructure some of the file sharing that we do on premises and apportion some into SharePoint-based solutions and some into file-based solutions. The benefits are the deep integration with the Office Pro Plus, as we mentioned earlier, this co-authoring collaboration, being able to share securely externally beyond the boundaries of the business. For example, you can create sharing links which are time limited or have a specific password for a specific file or folder. And those sorts of facilities mean that you can have more confidence in sharing your data and very specific data out to external partners that you're working with. The version control also very strong. Every edit that you make in Word is maintained, not quite every edit, but within reason, every edit that you make in Word is maintained as a version, so you can roll back and find previous versions pretty seamlessly. And of course, SharePoint also extends the paradigm of file sharing to allow you to attribute metadata to files in a much more orderly and structured way. Now, for some organizations, that's been widely adopted, and Microsoft and other organizations have been banging the metadata drum for a long time. It is a change, and we'll come on to talk about change briefly in a second. But it's certainly one of a value that, as we mature in our use of SharePoint, the businesses can really gain a lot from. The challenge around SharePoint solutions is, of course, it is a change of user experience. You're also going to have to think about the structure of your data because sites and document libraries work in different ways from file shares, and you can't just continue to build folder structures under them indefinitely. You need to think more about how the files are going to be used and who the audiences are, and make sure you design your SharePoint document repositories appropriately. So the question is, the next question is, how are our users and colleagues going to see these experiences? File-based solutions, of course, very familiar, but you can certainly improve capacity and performance. And as I said earlier, the NetApp solution can really add a lot of performance to apps that are dependent on that kind of file exchange. The IOPS available in the NetApp solution are really enormous. For SharePoint, they will love the co-authoring. It's amazing to be able to open an Excel spreadsheet in 2 different places and have people editing the cells at the same time. We no longer have to worry so much about those conflicts that DFS always introduced when somebody in Paris opened a spreadsheet and somebody in London opened it as well, and they ended up overwriting one another or creating parallel versions. The Office integration, as I keep mentioning, is very deep now, and the sharing that we've also touched on. But change of use is always hard, and supporting customers and users with adoption is an enormously important part of any kind of project like this. And I'd say it's equally important to the technical change that we are probably focused on. The success of one of these sorts of transformation projects is entirely going to be down to how well it's adopted and how efficiently and effectively the business can consume the new generation of services. It's never going to be a big bang. It takes time, but being able to offer up and share the bounty available, share the opportunity available with your users in ways that allows them to find and discover and explore these new facilities is worth every moment of effort that you spend on planning. So in terms of the effort required, lifting and shifting can be really quick. Azure Site Recovery is a pretty quick way of doing these things. You synchronize your servers up into Azure, and the cutover can be as little as 15 minutes to move from one to the other. Azure Files use familiar tools. Microsoft do have some storage management tools of their own, but by and large, you can use Azure file copying, or even simply mapping drives and copying data backwards and forwards. Clearly, there's a bandwidth dependency when you've got those Azure files living off-site, but Microsoft also have some facilities in the Azure Data Box range to allow you to put a caching device on site which sends everything that it sees up to Azure, or to save data onto what is effectively a little NAS box and send it by courier to Microsoft for uploading to Azure locally. Azure File Sync is a very similar experience. It can support deduplication on the operating system level with modern operating systems, and otherwise it sits there receiving data from your users, or from however it's getting there, and caching it up into Azure in order to tiering it into Azure in order to maintain the level of free space on your local servers. Again, but bandwidth requirements are there, and it's worth bearing in mind that if you're using Azure File Sync with very large files that are tiered into the cloud, when you open them, there will be some latency between asking for the file and it becoming available locally as Microsoft downloads it. SharePoint is not such a consistent experience with what you've got at the moment. You do need to spend some time planning the data architecture for SharePoint, because as I mentioned earlier, you have this concept of sites and document libraries, which is less familiar than file shares. And it's no longer the case you can have a single library and just build out millions and millions and millions of files underneath it. You need to be careful to structure it so the libraries become the containers for each security kind of grouping, I guess, each audience. And if you need to give access to information to different groups of people, then you should really structure them as different sites or different libraries so that you can maintain those security boundaries in a coherent way. The same kind of design principles need to extend to teams, and it's well worth reaching out to your partners and professional service providers to help you with structuring teams and SharePoint rollouts, because the paradigm is quite different from a file share. But as I hope I explained earlier, the benefits to the end users is endless. So there's so much benefit from a collaboration and usability point of view to thinking about putting that sort of content into SharePoint. So just to recap briefly, we've seen a range of different types of technical solutions based on file shares and several different approaches to that, and based on modern SharePoint collaborative kind of technologies. I think one of the key takeaways from my work in putting this presentation together today is that different approaches suit different data. It's not just a question of taking everything you've got in one system and putting it into something new today. It's well worth taking the time to explore and understand your data and make sure that it's aligned appropriately to the technology that you're going to use to maintain it. You don't have to maintain everything in the same system. It's no longer the case that one size fits all. Azure Files and Azure File Sync offer you a great parallel to your existing on-premises file shares, and work in very similar ways, but offering access to greater resiliency in the global Azure infrastructure, and also offloading some of the capacity burdens using Azure File Sync with tiering can really add, you can solve some of your capacity and storage infrastructure maintenance headaches on premises. And then for really fast performance, the NetApp solution is also worth considering in spite of the relatively higher costs. So you'll be pleased to hear I'm getting close to wrapping up here, and I think I just want to leave you with these kind of takeaways really. at this stage, when we have this opportunity to restructure and to adopt some new technologies, particularly for those looking at SharePoint-based technologies of SharePoint sites, OneDrive groups and teams, it's a real opportunity to understand your data and go back to the business and really think with the business about how they want to consume data and how they want to collaborate on the data on these files in future. It doesn't all have to go into the same place, and arguably as we adopt more of the SharePoint type technologies, the old ways of thinking about data in a monolithic sense and trying to avoid these silos, we have to kind of turn that on our heads a little bit. It's uncomfortable for those of us who've been in this business for a long time because we've been trying to avoid silos for a generation. But in actual fact, these days, data governance does need to be more granular, and we need to increasingly find ways of delegating the governance and security and compliance around data much closer to the business. It's no longer data governance cannot any longer be the business of a governance and compliance team sitting in a dark room controlling everything from the center. It has to be owned by the people with responsibility for that data across our businesses. And so there are some significant challenges around data governance in the modern SharePoint collaborative world. Spend some time making a plan. You've understood your data. You're talking to your audience about who they are, how they want to work and who they're working with. Plan, demonstrates, run a proof of concept and proof of value to the business. Show some of the stakeholders who can really benefit from these changes, how they can benefit, and then pilot it with small teams. Things like OneDrive can be rolled out relatively straightforwardly. It's a one-to-one mapping between user home drives and their OneDrive sites. But departmental shares going into SharePoint or into a new technology needs more planning and more forethought. And then engage with the users. Really help people to understand what they can how they can benefit from the new Office apps and SharePoint type functionality. We've recently been working with a tool set called Nulia, and Nulia is a way of kind of gamifying Office 365 adoption. It gives you little challenges and then and rewards for as it sees you doing new things. It entirely sits in the background and just pops up now and again to introduce you to a new concept and encourage you to try to do something a different way. And that kind of thing is not a formal classroom-based training or big video libraries and courses that you have to wade through. Just little snapshots and snippets of introductions that can encourage adoption and make it a bit more fun. You can create some games and competition amongst your teams to see if you can build the most skills and receive the most awards. And those sorts of things can really assist with adoption. But ultimately, we are in a time of huge technological change, and some of this is coming down towards us, whether we like it or not. We know from all our organizations that people are keen to adopt new technologies, and the current generation of new starters are totally used to self-service IT, and they don't like to be prescribed. So they will use WhatsApp and they will use shadow IT of all sorts. So we need to adopt and embrace these new ways of working and go for it. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. I hope it's been valuable. I recognize a very high-level overview, but if you do want a deeper dive into either your own particular organizational opportunities and challenges, then speak to your account manager at Bytes and engage with the workshops that Bytes run for a deeper dive on some of these things. I'm going to hand back now to the team to walk us through some of the questions. So do feel free to throw your questions into the chat and we'll see how we get on.
Thanks, Edmund. Yeah, I think we've got a few questions, so I'm just going to I'll read them out. There was a couple of questions earlier, so they'll kind of, as I read them out, they will relate to obviously what you're presenting at the time. So how do you cope with naming paths and linked documents?
So linked documents, in particular, we're thinking about Excel and that kind of thing, is certainly a challenge. Microsoft provides some assessment tools that allow you to understand the nature of linked documents and provide some automation around relinking them. But yeah, it certainly is a challenge. And but it's not completely insurmountable, and yes, there are certainly tools and approaches that can help you.
Okay, great. Hopefully a battle card to show key differences between Azure Files and SharePoint.
That's a great idea. I don't know whether Backlights have one already, but yeah, certainly if people are interested, that's something we can work on.
Will hybrid Active Directory authentication also support DFS targets or paths?
I don't think it does. It's very new. Literally, the preview was announced in the past week or so. But certainly, Azure File Sync can support DFS namespaces, and I think Microsoft actively encouraged it to be used that way. But Azure Files, I don't think will operate, and there isn't. DFS namespaces don't really have a paradigm for Azure Files because the data is all in one place.
Okay. Someone asked, just to confirm, Azure Files and Azure File Sync does not have the same capability for multiple users to work on the same document as the SharePoint does?
No, that's correct. So Azure Files and Azure File Sync are very much the same concept as your existing file shares. They can do snapshots in the same kind of way as Volume Shadow Copy can, but there's no integration and collaboration in the way that SharePoint operates. Yeah.
Okay. The SharePoint library limit of 5,000 files, is that a hard limit or a recommendation?
It's not actually a limit in the library in terms of the volume of content. It's a limit in the views. So my guidance to anybody looking at starting down the SharePoint route is to try to plan your data structures to keep within those kinds of constraints and be quite granular about it. But from a future forward point of view, yes, you can use views to access more than 5,000 items in the library or list in SharePoint, but you can't have a single view that will show you more than 5,000 items.
Okay.
So just to expand on that for a second, for anybody who's not completely aware of how SharePoint lists and libraries work, but a SharePoint library is effectively a database, and you can arrange arrange the items within that list and library in many different ways using views, which are parallel with views in a database, and particularly when you've got metadata and different columns associated with those documents, arranging them. If you've got metadata for a customer, for example, or a project ID, you could set up views to arrange it that way and overcome the item limit.
Yeah. Okay, great. So what would be the recommended solution for Mac users in design departments which work on huge files? Sure, there will be latency and delays whilst working on the files.
So I think Azure File Sync is an approach for that. Mac these days supports SMB3 pretty effectively, and the Azure File Sync approach will allow you to bring the working set of data locally into your local environment, but without having the limits of storage capacity that a local infrastructure might provide, might constrain you. With it also, Azure File Sync also allows you to do a similar kind of process as DFS and have access to those files in multiple locations, but it doesn't deal with the concurrency issues that we touched on earlier with things like Excel sheets, or particularly if you're working on a video or a big media file, there's nothing to stop two people trying to edit it at the same time.
Okay. I think this might relate back to what we were just talking about. Does this restriction still ring true if you have synced a SharePoint folder to Windows?
SharePoint folders synced to Windows using the OneDrive client absolutely do support co-authoring and collaboration in real time. So while the data is synced locally and therefore accessed locally, it still retains its references back up to SharePoint. And when you open them in Office apps or any of the supported apps, it works directly into SharePoint and can handle it. If, for example, you're offline, sitting on a train or disconnected for some reason, then the new syncing technologies have become very sophisticated about merging changes back in that have been made by different collaborators at different times and keeping them in sync. You get some slight, it's possible to get some slightly odd artifacts, but by and large, it works pretty effectively. It's unusual now to find that you get a mismatch or a conflict.
Okay, and will Azure File Sync do file locking like a file share or not like DFS?
File sync is more like DFS. Files does some degree of file locking. And if you've got a detailed question about that in the specific question, do take it offline and we'll come back to you with a proper answer.
Yeah, sure. And then someone asked if there's are there licensing differences between the approaches? If there are, there might be a number of sort of various different licensing questions. So, you can always speak to your Bytes account manager, and they'll be able to actually come back with a real specific answer.
But at a very high level, all Azure services are licensed on or provided on a subscription consumption basis, based on, so for lift and shift, you'd be paying for the infrastructure cost of VMs and storage and network traffic. For files, you're consuming storage at a storage rate. For the NetApp solution, again, it's consumed on a storage basis. So if you only have a very small storage requirement, but it needs to be very high performance, then that can be viable. But their price per gigabyte is considerably higher than the standard Microsoft stuff. I didn't really touch on it very deeply, but there are various pricing tiers for different types of storage based on whether it's standard, i.e. kind of hard disk type storage, or premium SSD storage. And there's now also an ultra storage tier, which is kind of twice as fast as SSDs as the premium tier. So those also all affect the pricing. And in terms of just licensing, the SharePoint type technologies are by and large included in Office 365. You can buy them as standalone packs, but it's a per user basis for a certain amount of storage. And then if you really push the boundaries of Microsoft's allowances, you can buy additional storage for SharePoint.
Okay, thank you. And then I think we've just got time for sort of like one more question. What is the recommended backup solution for Azure Files and Azure File Sync?
Well, Azure Files, let's just focus on that for a second, can be geo-redundant, both locally and within the Azure zone, but also more redundant for smaller file shares up to 5 terabytes. They can be globally redundant as well. In terms of backup, automated snapshots within Azure allow you to access the snapshot of your files at any time, and they're natively incremental. So you're only paying for the cost of the snapshots. You're only paying to store the cost of the incremental change rather than a whole snapshot for every the whole data volume for every snapshot. No doubt you could also implement external backups with third-party vendors for this stuff as well, accessed in a very similar way to your conventional file shares. But by and large, I think containing it within Azure is sufficient in many cases.
Perfect, thank you. So I think that's about all we've got time for. If you do have any other questions, you can obviously reach out to your Bytes account manager, or you can email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk, and we'll get the answers over to you as soon as we can. If you could just fill in the feedback form at the end, we'd really do appreciate your response to those sort of things for sort of webinars moving forward. And you can also, you know, make a comment if you are interested in a one-to-one engagement with Bytes and Incentra, or, you know, more licensing questions that you might have. Then you'll be able to just comment on the form at the end. We will be sharing a copy of the recording, so you can play that back or share it, you know, amongst your team. And yeah, thank you, Edmund, for your time on the webinar today, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.